I mean, think about it. If you were handed, like, the perfect, flawless blueprint for a utopian society today,
Right.
and you just implemented it tomorrow, just flipped a switch.
You'd think that's the dream, right?
Yeah. But by Friday, your society would be in ashes. I mean, it is probably the greatest, most persistent myth of human history that complete systems can arrive complete.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have this really deep-seated assumption that a constitution is finalized in a single, brilliant convention.
Like magic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or that an operating system is released in its final perfect version on day one.
Right. Or a revolution just produces this complete social architecture overnight. But if you actually look at the mechanics of reality, doing that doesn't build a society. It destroys it.
It's a devastatingly common misunderstanding of how human beings process change. I mean, we look back at foundational texts or historical turning points, and we see the bound book.
The finished product.
Yeah, the finished legal code, the established institution. And because we interact with that finalized artifact, we retroactively assume the delivery method was instantaneous.
Which is just wild when you really think about it.
It is. But what we're dissecting today, it just obliterates that assumption entirely.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. For you listening right now, we are looking at a text today, not as a piece of ancient literature and definitely not as a theological sermon.
No, not at all.
We are looking at this as a masterclass in sociology and systems engineering. We are pulling from an analytical lecture, specifically lecture 8 out of 15 from the Tolu Islam digital audio series.
Delivered by Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Right, and he's breaking down verses 32 through 34 of Surah Al-Furqan. And I just want to set the ground rules right now for you, the listener. We are stripping away centuries of sentimental translation here.
We have to.
Yeah, we are looking at this purely to extract the foundational principles of civilizational survival, just the mechanics of it.
Which is exactly what the source material does. I mean, Parwez approaches the text literally like an engineer looking at a schematic.
Yeah.
The core tension we're exploring is why every successful transformative system in human history absolutely has to be implemented in stages.
It's basically a law of social physics.
It is. The receiving community, the human hardware, if you will, has to physically and sociologically build the capacity to run each stage of the software before the next update can even function.
Right, so let's jump straight into the inciting incident of this text, because verse 32 of Al-Furqan, it captures this exact clash of expectations.
It really sets the stage.
Yeah, so the systems architect is rolling out a new social code, and the historical objection raised against it was phrased as a direct challenge. The text says, "La nuzila alayha al-Quranu jumlatan waidatan."
And translated, that essentially means, why was this code not sent down all at once as a single complete package?
Okay, let me stop you right there, because if I'm playing devil's advocate here, that sounds like a totally reasonable demand.
It does sound reasonable on the surface.
Right. I mean, if I purchase enterprise software for my company, I don't want 20% of the code on Monday and the rest drip-fed to me over the next decade.
No, you want the whole thing.
I want the complete application. So if this is supposed to be the ultimate operating manual for a functional society, why hold out? It almost feels like the architect is just being evasive.
Well, it feels that way until you analyze who is actually asking the question.
Okay.
Because Parwez provides some really vital historical and socioeconomic context here. In 7th century Arabia, specifically in Mecca, you weren't dealing with a society of blank slates eagerly awaiting a new constitution.
They weren't just sitting around asking for a better way to live.
Exactly. You were dealing with a deeply entrenched, highly lucrative corporate oligarchy.
Wow.
The elites controlled the trade routes, they controlled the socio-religious tourism around the Kaaba, and they had a massive vested interest in the status quo.
So they were basically a cartel.
A very powerful cartel. So when they demanded the social code all at once, it was not born of sincere impatience.
Right.
Or, a genuine desire to implement a more equitable society. It was pure strategic obstruction. It was a sabotage tactic.
Wait, how does asking for the full manual sabotage the system? I mean, if anything, wouldn't they want to hide the manual so nobody could read it?
You have to think about the cognitive and institutional load. If you force a complete revolutionary system onto an unprepared society, the system crashes. Period.
Oh, I see.
If the entire socioeconomic code is dropped on day one, the vested interests know exactly what will happen. The community will be paralyzed by information overload. They literally won't know where to start.
Oh man, it's the Monday morning IT disaster.
Yes, exactly that.
Like, if you're the lead IT architect for a global company of 50,000 people, and they're all used to using paper ledgers,
Right.
and you push a massive, fully integrated digital infrastructure to the network overnight without any stage training, the system just crashes.
Completely falls apart.
People can't do their jobs, productivity flatlines, and the whole workforce revolts.
And what did the executives, the ones who never wanted the new system in the first place, what did they say on Tuesday morning?
They say, well, look, we tried your utopian digital system, and it was a complete disaster. It's unworkable, so we are going back to paper ledgers immediately.
Precisely. The cartel demands the complete code so they can weaponize its inevitable failure.
That is incredibly devious.
It's brilliant in a dark way.
Mm.
The gap between the perfect theoretical code and the messy, flawed reality of day one. That gap becomes permanent evidence that the new system is just an impractical fantasy.
Right.
They use the demand for completeness to guarantee the survival of the status quo.
So they don't even have to argue against the ethics of the new system?
Yeah.
They just have to ensure its implementation fails catastrophically?
Okay, so
Oh.
how does the text respond to that? If I'm the architect and I see this cartel actively trying to bait me into a system crash, what's my counter move? The text responds with verses 32 and 33, which the source material identifies as really one of the most sophisticated statements of pedagogical and systems theory in existence.
That's a big claim.
It is, but it backs it up. Gives two precise phrases. The first is "Kalegeka linutabita bihi fuaraka," and the second is "Waratalnahu tartila."
Okay, let's take those one at a time, because I know we need to do some serious linguistic excavation here to get past all the traditional, sentimental interpretations.
Definitely.
Let's start with that first one. Nutabata.
So nutabata comes from the Arabic root thbt. Now, conventionally, in a religious context, people read this with a sort of spiritual softness.
Right.
They translate it as to comfort or to reassure. The image is like an anxious leader being patted on the back by the divine.
Which totally neuters the engineering aspect of it.
Completely neuters it. Parwez just strips that away entirely. The root THET actually means to stabilize, to make firm, to give a root system to. It is structural language. It's about anchoring. So the staged delivery of the social code isn't primarily for the psychological convenience or comfort of the listener.
Interesting.
It is a deliberate mechanism for the structural stabilization of the reform project itself.
So we aren't talking about a warm hug here. We're talking about pouring concrete and laying rebar.
Yes, exactly. Each stage of the social code, when implemented properly, creates the institutional and psychological substrate that makes the next stage possible.
Right.
You cannot install the roof until the load-bearing walls are fully cured. If you try, the whole structure collapses. The gradual rollout is what allows the root system of this new society to actually take hold in the rocky soil of human habit.
But what exactly is being stabilized? Because the full phrase is nutabita bihi fuadaka, and my understanding is that fuad is almost universally translated as heart.
Yeah, that's the standard translation.
Right, so that we might stabilize your heart. Again, we're back to Hallmark card territory. It sounds very emotional.
And this is where the source's reading is just so radically different. Parwez rejects the sentimental heart translation entirely. In classical Arabic, and especially in the context of this systemic analysis, Fuad represents the organizational center.
The organizational center, oh.
It is the command and control node of the reform movement.
That entirely shifts the stakes from like an emotional internal state to a very strategic external reality.
It does. It's the capacity for strategic coordination. It's the ability to maintain direction, focus, and resilience under intense adversarial pressure.
Which they were under.
Absolutely. If you are dismantling a corporate oligarchy, your leadership team and your core early adopters are going to be under relentless attack, economically, socially, physically.
Okay, let me apply this to a modern scenario to see if it tracks.
Go for it.
Let's say you have a disruptive startup that is actively threatening a massive monopolistic tech giant.
Classic David and Goliath.
Right. So the tech giant starts launching hostile takeover bids. They start poaching employees and running massive smear campaigns in the media.
Yeah.
Now, if the startup's founder tries to completely restructure their own company, launch 5 new products, and change their entire business model all in the same week that they are under attack.
It's game over.
Right. Their fuad, their organizational center, will shatter. The leadership will burn out. Communication will break down entirely.
Exactly. They lose their strategic coordination.
Yeah.
But if they roll out those changes incrementally If they stabilize their core operations first, build a loyal user base, secure their supply chain, and then launch the next product, they maintain their organizational center.
So that we might stabilize your organizational center. That is brilliant. It means the system is delivered in stages specifically so the leadership actually has the bandwidth to process it,
Right.
to implement it, and to survive the cartel's attacks without having their operational capacity destroyed by just managing too many revolutionary changes simultaneously.
Which brings us to the actual mechanism of that staging.
Hmm.
The second phrase, Uratanahu Tartila. We arranged it in a measured, calibrated sequence.
Tartil. So this isn't just, a random delay. It's not just the architect saying, well, we'll give you chapter 2 and we feel like it.
Far from it. It is precision engineering. The sequencing of the social code's delivery is precisely calibrated to match the community's implementation capacity at every single stage.
Ah.
And Parwez uses two really vital analogies to explain Tartil. The first one is a pearl necklace.
Okay, I can visualize that. Loose pearls versus a strung necklace.
Right. Loose pearls are just scattered individual data points.
Mm-hmm.
But when they are strung together, each pearl naturally links to the next in a highly specific order, creating a cohesive, structured whole.
You can't put the 10th pearl on the string until you've threaded the 9th.
Exactly.
I like that, but let me challenge it a bit. A pearl necklace is static. I mean, once it's built, it just sits there in a jewelry box. A society is alive, it's dynamic. So is there a better analogy for that?
Well, the source provides a second one, which addresses exactly that dynamic nature, is the biological growth of a plant.
Oh,
Yeah, a plant doesn't leap from a seed to a fully fruit-bearing tree overnight. It goes from a sprout to a stem to branches to leaves to flowers and then to fruit.
It's a progression.
A necessary progression. Each stage is an absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for the next. The flower cannot exist without the branch. The branch cannot exist without the stem.
That tracks perfectly with the idea of building capacity. I mean, you can't just yell at an apple seed to produce an apple.
Right.
It physically needs time for the cellular structure to form. It needs to extract nutrients from the soil to build the trunk before the trunk can even support the weight of the fruit.
And this biological systemic approach is exactly why the source text takes such a hardline stance against superstition, against asceticism and mystical shortcuts. The text insists on grounded physical, sociological reality.
This is a great pivot, actually, because I want to get into the people who are actually managing this plant growth,
Right.
or threading these pearls. The source does a massive paradigm shift on two very famous terms in the text, Muzamil and Mudathird.
Yeah, this is a huge paradigm shift.
Yeah,
Traditionally, these terms have painted a picture of a monastic prophet.
right.
The conventional image you'll find in almost any standard commentary is someone wrapped in a blanket, retreating to a cave, doing ascetic meditation, and just shutting out the world to receive mystical visions.
The solitary mystic on the mountaintop. It's a very romantic, individualized image. We see it at movies all the time.
We do. But Parwez points out that asceticism, this idea of retreating from society into caves or jungles to find enlightenment, that was an imported concept.
Really?
Yeah, it came from other traditions, from monasticism, and was retroactively projected onto this text centuries later.
So what did the words actually mean in classical Arabic before that sentimental overlay was added?
Well, the word muzamil does not mean a man hiding in a blanket.
Yeah.
In the context of 7th century socioeconomics, it refers to the caravan leader.
Wait, really?
Yes, specifically, the master logistician who carefully selects and balances companions for a grueling, long-term journey.
Okay, wait. A caravan leader. That changes the entire vibe of the text from a solitary monk to, like, a CEO or a master project manager.
Completely. And the source material uses a fantastic historical anecdote to illustrate the sheer mechanical necessity of this role. He talks about the old days in the Indian subcontinent,
Okay.
taking a bumpy, horse-drawn carriage and Eka on a long journey, say from Delhi to Agra.
Oh, man, I can only imagine the suspension on those things was totally non-existent.
Exactly, you felt every single pebble.
Yeah.
Now, physics dictates that the weight on both sides of that carriage needs to be perfectly balanced.
Right.
If you put heavy cargo on one side and nothing on the other, the carriage tilts, creates immense friction on the axle, exhausts the horse, and eventually breaks down.
So you need physical equilibrium.
But it's more than just physical weight. It's psychological equilibrium.
Yeah.
Imagine being trapped in that tiny carriage for days with someone whose temperament completely clashes with yours.
Oh, the worst.
Someone who complains endlessly, panics at every bump in the road, or is just highly volatile. the journey becomes psychological torture. Your organizational center shatters.
You lose your mind.
You really do. Parwez actually mentions a famous poet, Mir Taqi Mir, who paid a carriage driver to let him out mid-journey, in the middle of nowhere.
Just to get away.
Yes. Just to escape the unbearable conversation of his fellow passengers. He famously said he didn't hire the carriage to ruin his mind.
That is hilarious, but also so true. I think everyone listening has been on a road trip with the wrong person.
Oh, absolutely.
It is soul-crushing. But if we map that onto Muzamil, it's profound. The caravan leader's primary job, before the revolution even begins, is to select companions whose temperaments, physical resilience, and psychological fortitude are actually balanced.
Yes.
You need people who will hold the line when the cartel attacks, not people who will panic, turn on each other, or exhaust the leadership from the inside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Translating Muzamil as systems builder or caravan leader rather than cave-dwelling ascetic, it radically changes our understanding of the text.
It really does.
It shifts the entire focus from an individual internal mystical experience to a highly coordinated external socioeconomic restructuring.
Right.
You cannot organize a societal revolution from inside a cave.
Right.
You have to be in the marketplace. You have to be selecting your team, balancing the loads, and managing interpersonal dynamics.
Let me push back on this a little bit, though. If Muzamil is this master logistician organizing the team, doesn't that imply the entire new social system is hopelessly dependent on a single charismatic leader?
What do you mean?
Well, if the caravan leader dies or gets taken out by the Meccan elites, doesn't the carriage just crash? That seems incredibly fragile for a civilizational operating system.
That is a phenomenal question. And it really gets to the heart of why the text isn't just a biography of one man. The role of Muzamil is the initiation phase of the system. The leader builds the initial team, but the system itself, the code being delivered through Tartil, is designed to decentralize that leadership over time.
Oh, I see.
The goal of the caravan leader is to train the passengers to eventually drive the carriage themselves. That's why stabilizing the organizational center, the fuad, is so critical. The center must become an institution, not just an individual.
That makes perfect sense. The leader is the catalyst, not the permanent crutch. And that brings up the other term, mudathir.
Right. So if Muzamil is the caravan leader assembling the team, mudathir is the one who brings the spring after a dead winter.
Spring.
Yeah. It is the active force that initiates a revolutionary new order, bringing life to a stagnant, calcified society. Again, it is an active societal role. It's an intervention in reality, not a retreat from it.
So if building a society requires this incredibly careful staging the step-by-step plant growth of Tartil, and it requires meticulously selecting the right people to balance the sociological carriage, the Muzamil,
Yeah.
then we circle right back to the original objection. The cartel's demand to have the entire system delivered all at once, Jamlahon Wadaitin, is practically an act of war.
It is an attempt to overload the human capacity of the movement before it can even balance the carriage. Which brings us to the core issue of human cognition and how we actually process massive structural changes. Parwez refers to this dynamic as the engine of reason and the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Let's dive deep into that, the all-at-once objection. We established that dropping a 1,000-page manual causes information overload. But what actually happens to the human brain and to a society's collective psychology when you overload it like that?
You strip away their ability to build rational conviction.
How so?
If the entire social code arrives at once, the community simply cannot test it. They cannot observe its effects. They are forced to either reject it entirely because it's just too overwhelming, or accept it entirely on blind faith because they haven't had time to understand it.
And the source is arguing that the system actively despises blind faith, right?
Vehemently. And this is a critical point. Traditionally, religious frameworks often frame faith as unthinking, unquestioning belief. Just accept the whole package because it's sacred. Don't ask questions.
Right.
But the text Parwez is analyzing argues the exact opposite. It explicitly notes that those who accept things blindly, without using their intellect, without evaluating evidence, without a step-by-step understanding, they are described as cattle.
Cattle. That is a brutal assessment.
It is.
It implies that blind submission is literally subhuman.
Because human beings are endowed with an intellect. True faith, the text argues, is conviction based on reason and objective observation. And this is where the sequence rollout, the Tartil, becomes the engine of reason.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does a slow rollout build rational conviction?
Well, when the code is rolled out in stages, the community can observe the objective results of stage one. Let's say stage one involves a radical new rule about wealth distribution, or eliminating a specific predatory lending practice in the market. The community implements it. They struggle with it, sure, but they do it. Then they look around.
And what do they see?
They see that it actually stabilizes the local market. They see poverty decrease. They see social cohesion improve.
So the objective observation of success builds empirical confidence.
Exactly. That verifiable result builds rational conviction, true faith in the system. They now have the intellectual and experiential confidence to say, okay, the architect was right about stage one. I trust the blueprint for stage two.
It makes perfect sense.
It is an iterative engine of reason, driven by verifiable results at each step, rather than a demand for blind submission to a massive, untested theoretical construct.
I want to ground this in a biological analogy because earlier we talked about plant growth, but I think human physiology is even more relevant here. Parwez uses a psychiatric analogy, right?
He does, and it's a very powerful one. He compares societal transformation to a psychiatrist treating a patient with a severe nervous condition.
Right.
If someone has deeply ingrained neural pathways of anxiety, trauma, or addiction, the psychiatrist doesn't sit them down for a single 60-minute session, hand them a manual of healthy thoughts, and say, okay, here is the complete operating system for a healthy brain. Go implement it.
Because the brain literally cannot do it. The physical synapses haven't been wired for it yet.
Exactly. A complete psychological overhaul requires multiple staged sessions. The therapist introduces a concept. The patient processes it. They try to implement it in their life. They inevitably fail or stumble.
As you do.
Right. They come back to the therapist, they analyze the friction, they adjust, and slowly, over months or years, they physically build new neural pathways. Societal transformation operates on the exact same biological and psychological principles.
This maps so perfectly onto the concept of habit formation. For you listening, it's like training for a marathon.
Perfect analogy.
You cannot give someone an Olympic-level marathon training manual on day one and expect them to run 26 miles that afternoon. It's physically impossible. Their bones would fracture. Their heart would literally give out.
And if they try and fail, what happens? They will conclude that running is impossible and they'll never try again.
Exactly. The physical capacity has to be built in sequence. The first week of training, just getting off the couch and jogging 1 mile a day literally creates the microscopic muscle fibers, the bone density, and the capillary beds required for the second week of training.
Yeah.
The early stages create the physical substrate required to survive the later stages.
That is the perfect modern way to understand Tartil. The stage one laws create the institutional and sociological muscle fibers required for the stage two laws to function. If you skip stage one, the community's infrastructure will simply tear.
Which brings us to another highly misunderstood term in the text, taskia-i nafs. Because in conventional translation, this sounds like you're going to a spa for your soul.
It really does. Conventional translations render it as mystical purification of the soul. It conjures images of fasting in a desert until you stop having bad thoughts.
Very passive.
Right. Parwez absolutely dismantles this. He redefines taskia-i nafs strictly in socioeconomic and developmental terms as growth and development.
Growth and development, so it's active.
It is the tangible, iterative, gritty process of developing human capacity. It's not about retreating to a corner to think pure thoughts. It is the immensely difficult, time-consuming work of changing human habits.
Breaking old economic addictions.
Yes. Dismantling systemic prejudices and learning to operate within a new social contract.
Yeah.
You have to build the new muscle memory of a society stage by stage.
Okay, but let's deal with reality here. If you are dismantling a corporate oligarchy, breaking economic addictions, and rewiring the muscle memory of an entire society step by step, the cartel is not going to just sit quietly and watch you train for this marathon.
Oh, definitely not.
They are going to attack you at every single mile marker. They're going to launch counter-arguments, spread misinformation, and try to break your organizational center.
They absolutely will. And this is where the architectural genius of this social code truly shines. Because it doesn't just survive those attacks. It doesn't just put up a defensive shield.
What does it do?
It actually ingests those attacks and uses them as fuel to upgrade its own software.
That sounds like science fiction. How does a sociological system use an attack as an upgrade?
This is what Parwez calls the law of requital, or mukafat-e-amal. And we see this operating heavily in verse 33, which is the second half of the architect's response to the cartel.
Okay, what does verse 33 say?
The verse states, وَلْيَأْتُونَكَ بِمَثَلٍ إِلَى بِالْآكِ وَسَنَ تَفْسِيرًا.
Let me break that down. They do not bring you any example or argument, but that we bring you the truth and the best explanation.
Yes. The source defines this as the law of requital operating at the epistemological level.
Epistemological meaning the theory of knowledge.
Right. It means that every single argument, every sneer, every piece of sabotage launched against the rational social code inherently forces a clarification, a refinement, and a deepening of that code.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm really grasping the mechanics of this. Are you saying that without the attacks, the code wouldn't reach its full potential?
That is precisely what the text implies. The adversarial challenge is not a threat to the system. It is the mechanism by which the system articulates itself.
Oh, wow. It's like red teaming in cybersecurity.
Please know that.
So when a software company builds a new network, they hire a red team of hackers to relentlessly attack their own system.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the hackers try every trick, every exploit, every phishing scam they can think of. The attacks expose the vulnerabilities in the code. And then the developers write patches asana tafsira, the better explanation, the stronger code to fix those vulnerabilities.
That is a phenomenal parallel. The complaints from the vested interests, the people yelling, why isn't this happening all at once? Or why aren't there angels delivering this code to us? These aren't just annoyances to be ignored.
They are data points.
They act as socio-intellectual stress tests, a social code that is tested by adversarial challenge and then responds with a precise, reasoned explanation, develops real-time robustness.
Think about the last time someone fiercely criticized a project you were working on at your job, or a belief you held. Your immediate human instinct was probably to get defensive, to shut down the conversation or to just yell louder.
That's human nature.
Right. But what the source is arguing here is that the defensive crouch is the worst possible reaction. When the cartel launches a critique, the system doesn't just say, shut up and submit. It responds with the deeper logic.
Exactly. By engaging with the challenge, the system builds out its own intellectual infrastructure. It forces the community, the passengers in the carriage to articulate exactly why they are doing what they are doing.
Right.
If someone asks, why are we banning this lucrative lending practice? The leadership can't just say, well, because the manual says so. They have to explain the macroeconomic damage that practice causes. The system sharpens itself on the whetstone of its enemies' arguments.
I love that. The whetstone of its enemies' arguments. It makes me think of an immune system.
Oh, yeah.
We've been talking about biology. If you keep a child in a completely sterile bubble from birth, their immune system never encounters a pathogen. It never learns to identify threats. It never produces antibodies.
Right. The system remains entirely naive.
So when that child finally steps outside the bubble at age 10, the very first common cold they encounter could be devastating or even lethal because their immune system has no learned responses. The attacks from the pathogens actually teach the immune system how to function. The friction is the feature.
And that immune system analogy perfectly aligns with the source's brutal critique of religious traditionalists. Because what do traditionalists usually do when a new idea, a scientific discovery, or a skeptical question challenges their framework?
They usually declare the framework sacred and unapproachable. They say, you can't ask that. That's blasphemy. Just believe.
Precisely. They try to suppress challenges. They think they're protecting the code. But according to verse 33, they are actually putting the social operating system into a sterile bubble.
By shielding the system from intellectual testing, they are literally suffocating it. They prevent the system from developing the robust intellectual antibodies it was explicitly designed to build through the law of requital.
It's a tragic irony. In their zeal to protect the system, they render it intellectually fragile and obsolete. The text points out that human knowledge is naturally accumulative. Parwez uses the analogy of a snowball rolling down a mountain.
As it rolls, it gathers more snow, growing larger and denser.
But it doesn't just gather snow. It incorporates the terrain it rolls over. It picks up dirt, leaves, rocks. Human understanding is meant to grow by accumulating knowledge, facing new historical environments, wrestling with new economic realities, and integrating those experiences into the core framework.
A system that cannot accumulate new responses to new challenges. A system that refuses to roll down the hill is a dead system. It just melts.
And Parwez highlights a devastating phrase from the broader text: to mock those who idealize the past and refuse to engage with the present. It describes these traditionalists as having their eyes on the back of their heads.
Eyes on the back of their heads. That is a terrifying image.
Think about the physics of that. If your eyes are on the back of your head, you can only see where you have been. You can see your glorious history, your idealized ancestors, the completed artifacts of the past.
Right.
You might even be able to describe them in beautiful, poetic detail.
But you are completely fundamentally blind to the terrain you are actually walking into.
Exactly. You are marching into the future, but you are completely unaware of the cliffs, the predators, the new economic realities, or the technological shifts right in front of you. You will inevitably stumble and fall into the abyss because you cannot navigate the present reality. You have rejected the snowball of accumulative knowledge in favor of a static, frozen snapshot of the past.
Let me synthesize this because the implications are just massive. If a community or a company or even an individual suppresses adversarial challenge to protect their operating system, they are blinding themselves. They are walking backward into the future.
That is the synthesis of everything we've talked about today. The principle of stage revelation, the Tartil we see in verses 32 and 33, is not some historical curiosity isolated to 7th century Arabia.
Right.
Parwez is arguing that this is a universal, unbreakable law about how social transformation works at the systems level, at any point in human history.
It's basically the blueprint for reality. Any community attempting to implement a new social architecture must use a staged delivery model. You have to match the implementation demand to the current cognitive and institutional capacity of the people.
You have to.
You have to build capacity at each stage, creating the muscle fibers for the next marathon mile.
And crucially, you must allow adversarial challenges to sharpen the articulation of the system at every step. You need the pathogens to build the antibodies. You need the cartel's attacks to force you to generate the Tafsir, the best explanation.
Because the demand for all-at-once software downloads into human societies fundamentally misunderstands human architecture.
Yeah.
We are not hard drives that can be wiped and rewritten in an instant.
No, we really aren't.
Our deeply ingrained habits, our economic dependencies, our institutional inertia, all of it must be rebuilt stage by stage. The Tartil, the measured sequence, is not a bug in the system. It is not the architect withholding information to be annoying.
Right.
It is the only feature that makes the implementation actually work in the physical world.
The delay is the design. And that brings us back to the organizational center, the FUID. Stabilizing that center, Nuthabita Bihi Fuadaka, is not a one-time event that happened centuries ago. It's an ongoing, never-ending function.
It has to be.
The reform project must constantly respond to new challenges with new clarity, which means the system is alive.
It is a dynamic equilibrium, not a static monument.
It's the ultimate synthesis of permanence and change. The underlying principles, the core structural code, remain permanent, but the application, the articulation, and the institutional capacity are constantly changing, constantly growing, constantly refining themselves against the friction of reality.
Wow.
That is how a civilization survives. Not by hiding in a cave and being a solitary mystic, but by stepping into the marketplace, leading the caravan through the desert, balancing the load, and facing the terrain.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? Why should you care about a sociological breakdown of a 7th century text and the machinations of a Meccan trade cartel?
It's a fair question.
Because the physics of human change are universal. Whether you are a founder trying to change a toxic corporate culture at your startup, a community leader trying to reform a local organization, or just an individual trying to completely overhaul your own personal life and destructive habits, you cannot expect day one perfection.
You really can't.
You cannot demand the all-at-once download from yourself.
If you try to force a complete systemic overhaul on yourself or your team by Monday morning, you will crash the system. Your FUID will shatter.
You must embrace the staged rollout. You have to endure that deeply uncomfortable, messy space where the old system is being actively dismantled and the new system is still building its capacity. You have to let the stage 1 roots take hold in the concrete before you expect the stage 3 structure to bear weight.
And perhaps most importantly, you must welcome the pushback. When you try to change a deeply ingrained habit and your brain throws a rationalization at you about why it's too hard or why you should quit.
Or when you try to change a company policy and an entire department revolts.
Right. That is not a sign of failure.
It's the law of requital in action. It's the red team testing your code. It is an opportunity to articulate exactly why the change is necessary to provide the better explanation. It is the friction that sharpens your resolve and your strategy.
Beautifully put.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, drawing on that incredible imagery from the source. We talked earlier about the human desire for a clean, black and white medical X-ray. We want the certainty of a finalized artifact. We want the bound book, the completed skyscraper.
We all do.
But reality is the muddy waters of ongoing staged development. Look at your own life right now. Look at your career trajectory, your community dynamics, your deepest personal or political beliefs. What systems in your life are you treating as sacred, complete, and untouchable?
Hmm.
Are you keeping your beliefs or your strategies in a sterile bubble, refusing to let them be tested by the friction of opposing arguments? Because if you aren't actively exposing your operating system to the adversarial challenges of the present, if you aren't allowing your code to be sharpened by the whetstone of reality, are you just walking backward into the future with your eyes on the back of your head?
That is the question you have to ask yourself.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.